Okay, so we have a multiple of 6 plus 3 stitches. If you're following the pattern, you'll have 63 stitches. If you're doing a different size shawl, just make sure you have a multiple of 6 plus 3. I'm now at 21 stitches, which is also a multiple of 6 plus 3. So now we're ready to start our bind off. So we're going to start by binding off the first 3 stitches. So that means you're going to knit the first 2 and then pass the first stitch up and over the second stitch and off the needle. So even though we knit 2, that movement there counts as our first bind off. So we'll do 2. And then that one is now our third. Okay, so now we'll knit the third, but instead of binding it off another one, we fasten off the third like we were finished with the entire shawl. Because this yarn has a lot of texture to it, you want to make sure you keep your opening nice and loose and then secure it after you pull all the yarn through. Okay, so we're now going to drop the next 2 stitches, and I want you to unravel them all the way back to the beginning. The reason we do this now instead of doing them all at the end is because we need to know how wide it is in order to grab this yarn and leave it wide enough for moving over to knit the next stitch. So we're now going to knit the next stitch, but you want to make sure you drag it over enough that it equals the width of the drop stitches below it. And we're now going to start over and knit 2 stitches to bind off the first, then knit another one to bind off the second, knit another one to bind off the third, and now we're going to fasten this off for the fourth. So we'll make our loop a little bit elongated so we can pull our textured yarn through. You know, you don't want to make your loop really small and then have problem with your sequins pulling through. You'll get very angry with yourself. Okay, so we'll pull that tight. So now we have our next set of stitches completed, and we're now going to drop the next 2, and we'll unravel them back so that we know how long we want our loop to be before we start knitting and binding off the next stitches. And if you haven't dropped stitches before on purpose, you may really enjoy this process. Not only is it fun to watch them slink back down, but you'll realize how much extra yardage you get in your projects by incorporating drop stitches in your work. And using a textured yarn like this, I think that the most beautiful way to show off and showcase textured yarn is in drop stitches, because you can really see the beauty of the unusual yarn that way. Okay, so we'll go ahead now and grab our yarn and our needles, and we're going to see if we can match up the length. There we go. So we'll knit 1, knit 2 to bind off 1, and then we'll knit another one to bind off 2. We'll knit another stitch to bind off 3, and then we fasten off to bind off the fourth. I think one of the toughest things for me to learn when I first started knitting was how to count stitches for bind off. It's okay when it says, oh, just bind off the whole row, because then you just bind off the whole row. But when you have to bind off in pattern, it's very difficult sometimes to understand what action is counted. So like, you know how you knit 2 to bind off 1? It can be a little confusing unless you think about it in the broken down words that I'm using when I do this. So we're going to drop the next 2, and I'll really focus on the action again when I bind off the next one so you can understand what I'm talking about. So unravel down and show off these beautiful sequins and texture. So pretty. Okay, and now we're just going to bind off the rest of the row. So we're going to knit 2 to bind off 1, knit 2 to bind off 2, and knit 3 to bind off 3, and we'll just fasten off the last loop on our needles. In fact, we can cut the yarn a little shorter too. And I'll show you, look at how much bigger. We haven't even blocked this yet, and look at how much bigger our shawl is already. Isn't that amazing? And then I'll show you what the finished one looks like again. And here's our finished shawl, where we started with a cast on of 3 stitches. We increased on each side of every other row until we ran out of yarn, and then we did this special bind off of binding off a few stitches and then dropping it and fastening off, to then drop a few stitches, then to bind off a few and fasten off, to drop a few, and we continued that all the way across until we got this gorgeous little shawl.